Hey, how's it going? My name's Blossums and welcome to another Genshin Impact video, and today we're going to be going over some different Heizou team compositions that I've been personally enjoying, and well, a lot of people have been enjoying his character in general and have probably been asking themselves what teams to fit him in. Well, hopefully we'll answer that question for you today. And if you're wondering what the whole intro business was with Childe, well, when I was actually testing out Heizou's punches, I was using Childe as my test dummy a lot of the time, so I felt like throwing in some of those clips, as I thought it'd be pretty fun. But I'm sure you're wondering what teams you want to put your Heizou in, so let's go ahead and go over it. First, we'll go over what is probably the most popular team comp, that being the Electro Charged or Taser team comp, or as I like to call it, the Teizou comp. And it's popular for good reason. It's capable of good single target or multi-target damage, augments Heizou's kit well, and is probably the most flexible out of any of the teams that you'll see today. And what I mean by it augments Heizou's kit well is, well, his kit is fundamentally really good for Electro Charge at base, and this is because of the way Electro Charge fundamentally works. Oftentimes you can find yourself having Electro and Hydro applied to an enemy at a single time, and Heizou can then swirl both of those elements as well as get the debuff on something like Viridescent Venom, and then the other part of his kit buffs his Elemental Mastery whenever he uses Elemental Burst, or it buffs your allies' Elemental Mastery by 80, and Electro Charge scales really well off of Elemental Mastery, so you're increasing the damage that's doing, increasing the damage that your teammates are doing, and it all works very synergistically. And I mentioned this team's very flexible, but let's first go over my favorites for this team, and that's going to be Heizou, Xingqiu, Yelan, and Fischl, and then sometimes I swap out Yelan with Beidou. It depends if it's more of a single target or multi-target situation. Beidou is going to be far better in that multi-target situation, and is arguably better in general because she can be so good. But the reason I like this team so much is fundamentally, well, Xingqiu is phenomenal for Heizou in the fact that you get the increase of resistance to interruption, which is huge for Heizou to make sure you're actually able to punch everybody. And then you also get the damage resistance, which is nice because Heizou has relatively low HP. And then the Hydro application that the swords by default apply to enemies just by being near them. And then on top of that, of course, the off-field Hydro application that Xingqiu provides. He's an incredible unit for Heizou and a really good enabler for that Electro Charge reaction. And then characters like Yelan are of course increasing Heizou's damage in general over time during her burst, adding more Hydro application than we already have. But if you're using somebody like Beidou, then she's offering more crowd control for Heizou by the chain linking functionality of her elemental burst. If you ever see two, you're getting a shield on top of that, and you get damage resistance while her burst is up, similar to Xingqiu, and those stack so you won't be taking like any damage at all. So those two together are already really insane, and then Fischl's just a cherry on top to provide some extra electro application as well as some additional damage whenever a reaction happens. And any of those characters are fantastic, and those are probably my favorite for Electro Charge. But as I mentioned before, this team is the most flexible on the list. You can likely put in any Hydro unit or any Electro unit that you really enjoy, and it's probably going to serve you fairly well for an Electro Charged Heizou comp. A good example of this will be maybe swapping out one of these Electro units for somebody like Kuki Shinobu, or maybe slotting in somebody like Kokomi here if you want some more healing. Those are really good options too. You could fit in Ayato to increase the actual damage Heizou's normal attacks are doing in Ayato's burst, plus get the huge AoE Hydro there. You can fit in somebody like Raiden Shogun or Yae Miko. All of these characters work well, so you can generally use whatever Hydro or Electro users you enjoy and have good results. I would, however, really strongly recommend one thing when it comes to this team, and it is having that resistance to interruption that I mentioned about with Xingqiu. Just because if you get interrupted, you're going to be having a bad time, and in all honesty, it helps out a ton. That damage resistance and resistance to interruption is incredibly valuable, and that's the only thing that I think is really a requirement, is making sure you have some sort of resistance to interruption on the team, and then you can just kind of use whatever Hydro and Electro character that you really want. And just one more thing that I wanted to mention, Electro Charge is probably the most consistent at being able to swirl, because as I said, the way Electro Charge works, you're more often than not going to have one or the other element, or maybe even both on a character, making it very, very easy for Heizou to constantly swirl. Sometimes when you're doing elemental reaction teams, you can often accidentally take off the elements by causing a reaction, and then Heizou doesn't swirl anything, and you don't build up his stacks, and that can feel pretty bad. It's not that much of an issue and doesn't happen that often, but it almost certainly never really happens in an Electro Charge team comp. Alright, next up is probably one of the most played out trios in existence, and that is, of course, the national trio, if that's even what we're calling it now. It's like national team 800 at this point, but the core of Xingqiu, Bennett, Xiangling is so fantastic and has proven to be incredibly strong, and Heizou fits in there nicely as a debuffer and driver for the team, and you can also make him deal some extra damage via Bennett and buffing him up that way, so that's incredibly nice. And I don't think this is the best version of the quote-unquote national team, but this certainly is still a strong one because you still have the incredible core of probably some of the most broken 4-stars that we've had in the game to date, and Heizou only helps them by debuffing the enemies and increasing elemental mastery of the team. So there's nothing really, bad going on here. But as I said, not really much to say here. The trio themselves are incredibly strong, and adding Heizou is just kind of like a nice cherry on top, and it's not the most broken version of this team, but it is certainly a good one. And if you want to use Heizou this way, then it's going to be a good option, and pretty important that I mention it. Alright, and before we get into the realm of maybe some of the more interesting team comps, let me remind you to leave a like and subscribe if you're enjoying this kind of content. It helps me out a ton, and I really appreciate it. But let's talk about the next one. This team is probably one of the most interesting, and I just call it the big hit team, and it's all for that big number. This team doesn't really augment Heizou's kit in any specific way other than trying to reach the goal of making Heizou deal the most damage as you can, and that is going to be with characters like Zhongli, Mona, and Bennett. And of course, Zhongli has the all resistance shred of 20%, Mona has her insane burst that'll allow you to deal a bunch more damage, and then Bennett's going to be buffing your Heizou, all to make your punch deal as much damage as you possibly can. Now, of course, if you have characters like I believe it's C4 Jean, she has an Animo Shred, and I think maybe Venti does in one of his constellations. If you have those kind of characters, then that's going to be a better option than somebody like Zhongli, just because of the fact that those resistance shreds are generally better. But if you do need the shield to make sure your punch actually goes through, then, well, he's still a pretty good option. And this team's pretty fun. As I said, this is not like a competitive team. I would not recommend going into Spiral Abyss with this, just because it's all for trying to make your punch deal as much damage as possible. Mona is consistent enough of a Hydro Applier to where you can swirl her E skill fairly well, but realistically speaking, there's not a ton of off-field help here, so you might be struggling to build up those stacks, and it is just kind of all or nothing on the punch. But the nice thing is you do have the combo of Mona and Bennett on this team, which are already an incredible vaporized team combination in their own right, so you can just add on top of that with somebody like Heizou and deal big numbers along with the big number that Mona and Bennett would already be doing. So this is just kind of like a fun team. As I said, I don't think this is like the best team or anything, but if you want to make your Heizou deal as much damage as he can with one punch, this is going to be the team for you. All right, and then what I think is one of the most underrated team comps here is actually going to be a less of a team comp and more of a character pairing, and that is going to be Heizou and Kadehara Kazuha together. These two actually pair really well, and then the rest of the team is just kind of whatever you want to do. I'll tell you my favorites in just a second, but let's first talk about the synergy between these two. Heizou really does lack crowd control. He tries to have some, but it's not very strong at all. But Kazuha's crowd control is off the charts and really strong, and when you actually gather up a bunch of enemies with Kazuha, it makes it easier to hit all of them with Heizou's E skill, effectively multiplying your damage with his E skill there because you're just hitting multiple opponents very consistently, and that is incredibly nice and highly underrated. Not to mention that Heizou's increase of elemental mastery with his elemental skill actually does apply to Kazuha's elemental damage bonus he gives to the rest of the team whenever he swirls an element. Other characters like Sucrose don't actually apply to that, and there are some characters who do buff Kazuha and stuff. That's a whole case-by-case kind of scenario there, though, but Heizou does, in fact, actually increase Kazuha's elemental damage bonus he gives. Granted, it's not a ton, but it does help, and then Kazuha helps Heizou actually hit multiple opponents with his E skill. And my personal favorite pairing with these two is Kokomi and Raiden Shogun, just because they're both good at applying their elements, and then also Raiden Shogun increasing the damage of your elemental bursts and whatnot is extremely nice. And these two together are just pretty good. Kokomi also fills that role of a healer for the team, which is a little tight for this particular pairing in general. I will admit it can be a little hard to find a healer just because your healer also needs to be pretty good at applying their element. which can be a struggle to find and pair with another character. But if you do find them, like somebody like Kokomi and Raiden Shogun, then this is a really cool team composition to mess around with. And then another version of these two together with two other people are probably my other favorite of Mona and Diona. It's like a little mini freeze comp here. And Diona also contributes to Kazuha's elemental damage bonus increase if you have her C6, where she gives 200 elemental mastery to anybody in the circle with their HP over 50%. And I really like that too. This is a very cool team. And then Mona also, of course, increasing everybody's damage with her elemental burst. Pretty solid team. Those are probably my two favorite versions of that team, and this is kind of like a pseudo freeze team. The other one was like a pseudo electro charge team. And just one more kind of like meme version of this team that I just personally like, I don't think is very good at all. It doesn't even have a healer or like shield or anything, is Kazuha, Klee, Aloy, and Heizou, just because you can suck in all the bombs of Aloy and Klee together, causing some mil procs, and it's just kind of hilarious and fun to me, and that might appeal to you, so I thought I'd mention it. Next up is going to be your traditional freeze team for Heizou here, and this is my recommended version, where it has Heizou, Ganyu, Xingqiu, and Diona, but this team is fairly flexible too. We'll talk about that in just a second, but this is a really cool team for Heizou specifically. Freeze teams are cool because of the fact that Heizou doesn't have anything in his kit that is going to constantly shatter opponents. One of the bad parts about having Kazuha in a freeze team is that he's going to be shattering opponents whenever he does his E skill, but with Heizou, you don't really have that problem, and it's very nice to just perma freeze literally everybody. And the reason I picked Ganyu here is just, of course, because her elemental burst is crazy for freeze teams, having 100% potential uptime if you got good energy recharge on a big AoE of cryo is fantastic. It also increases the cryo damage bonus by 20% by anybody in there, so it's all around a phenomenal elemental burst for freeze teams. Xingqiu's here because his hydro application is fantastic, and he gives you that resistance interruption that we talked about earlier, and the rain swords, as I mentioned earlier, also apply hydro themselves when you're close by, which is going to be helpful for Heizou's hydro application and making sure that you're swirling that. Of course, Xingqiu here is replaceable by Yelan easily. She's going to be fantastic in this slot too. I just like Xingqiu a little bit more for that rain sword hydro application, but Yelan does provide a little bit of grouping for enemies, especially smaller mobs, with her E skill, and that's something that you'll want to think about as well. Diona, of course, is a phenomenal option here too, and allows you to have an option like Yelan here because she's going to be providing that shield, and her elemental burst is going to be contributing elemental mastery and cryo application. Elemental mastery only if you have her C6, of course, but the cryo application consistently enough, and also be healing the team. Providing that shield is going to be phenomenal, and of course all the other benefits Diona has. She's a really solid unit overall, especially in a freeze team, and Heizou freeze teams are no exception. And as I said, this team has some replaceable units. If you have some other cryo units that you like in your freeze teams, they're likely going to fit fairly well here. Ayaka can sort of fit in here. She's not the best for it, but she definitely works. Shenhe is a really cool character for this, especially because of the fact that she can buff elemental skill and elemental burst damage. And that works for Heizou, which is really nice. If I had her, I'd probably be using her in a freeze team myself with Heizou, and I think that's a pretty cool combo. Kokomi, of course, also works pretty well here. It does confine your hydro application a little bit to her E skill, but that does open up another cryo slot if you really want to fit in another cryo character. However, this is my favorite version of the freeze team, and the one that I personally found to be my favorite. And you can use a lot of different characters, but this one I found to be probably my favorite out of them. Alright, well, that's going to be it for our Heizou team comps today. Hopefully this offered some insight to you guys on some different teams you might want to try with him. He's a really fun character, and even though he's not breaking the meta like I said, he's just fun to use, and finding those different team comps to actually use him in can enhance that fun factor even more, and hopefully I helped you out there. But other than that, I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day. Thanks for watching the video until the end. If you made it this far, I really appreciate it. But yeah, have a great rest of your day. I'll see you guys in the next video. My name is Blossums. Peace.